Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant doctor and psychiatrist based in Harley Street, London, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Alice Vernon. So Alice has written this amazing book called Troubled Sleep and the Stories We Tell About It, Night Terrors. And Alice Vernon, I'm going to read from the back of the book, is a lecturer in creative writing at Aberystwyth University, where she teaches students the fundamentals of storytelling. Her research focuses on representations of sleep in science and culture. This is her first book. So, Alice, welcome to the program. Congratulations on an amazing book. There's a lot that we can talk about. It's about various aspects of sleep. It's fascinating. One of the particular things you do very well, I mean, it's a gripping read, it reads like a novel, is you do a thing that very few people outside of science can do. I know I'm going to sound patronizing. You quote the research in a way that is very rigorous, but also not boring. And that's very unusual to be able to do that. And now there are many different things we can talk about with this book, but you yourself, we're going to start with you. You've got a strange relationship with sleep, it seems to me, which is kind of what drove you to write this book. Tell us a bit about you and sleep and dreams and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, my sleep has been odd ever since I was a child. So I used to sleepwalk as a toddler. I would hide my teddies in the airing cupboard and then cause an absolute ruckus in the morning because I couldn't find them, but I had been the one who'd hidden them. So I sleepwalked as a child. I don't do that so much now. Instead, my sleep has become more like an Edgar Allan Poe story. I tend to hallucinate quite a lot now, something called hypnopompic hallucinations. I have sleep paralysis quite regularly. I lucid dream, I have nightmares, all sorts of things. So every time I go to sleep, it's kind of like a bingo card of what sort of strange sleep disorder I would have tonight. So yes, it's a long history of odd sleep for me.
Are you frightened of going to sleep? Do you fear going to sleep?
Sometimes. So sometimes it's only happened occasionally. Usually I can't predict when I'm going to have these strange nights. Sometimes I won't have anything. I won't even remember my dreams sometimes. But occasionally I've had periods in my life where I've had maybe a week of the same sort of hallucination every night. And I think, when is it going to end? Is it ever going to end? Is it going to be every night now that I'm going to see this figure in my bedroom, or I'm going to see spiders all over my bed? And that does actually sometimes make me feel haunted in a way that is kind of like, well, it's going to happen tonight. It's happened for the last 5 nights. It's obviously going to happen tonight. And I do feel afraid sometimes to actually see these things again. And the expectation of knowing that it's likely that I'll see them again, that's usually what frightens me before I go to sleep.
You're very good at describing dreams that you've had, and you describe them in a very vivid way. Could you give us a few of them? Or there's a dream that opens the book, which is kind of a bit scary. I particularly like the scary dreams. I don't know why, but anyway, there's something about them that's really interesting. Tell us a bit about describe some of the vivid dreams that you've had.
So the dreams or the hallucinations?
Well, let's do both, but let's go with whichever one you want to go with.
So the way that I start the book is with one of these things called a hypnopompic hallucination, which is when you're just waking up from sleep, your brain is still in a sort of half dreaming state, and it will project sort of dream-like images into your waking sight, essentially. And it was New Year's Day, 2018, early hours. It was about 2:00 in the morning, I think. And I saw this woman by my bed very vividly. And usually with one of these hallucinations, I see it and then it disappears pretty much immediately. With a hypnopompic hallucination, you can still move, which is the difference, to sleep paralysis. So usually I'll see a spider and I'll kind of go, or throw my pillow across the room or something. But with this, she just stood there and she stayed for longer. It was probably even so only a couple of seconds, but it was longer, considerably longer than usual. And we just sort of made eye contact for a bit. And she had this very vivid, sort of glowing white blouse on. I mean, she looked perfectly normal. She had curly hair, somebody that I might see in Tesco. But there was something really sinister about her, and she just wouldn't go. And I was kind of blinking and, trying to wake up properly. So there's that as well. But in terms of dreams and nightmares, I had a sort of a slightly odd period in my life when I was an adolescent, where I had a teacher who was not particularly professional, shall we say. And so I continued to have nightmares about her. And in one of these dreams, I was playing hide and seek in a mansion, as we would all do in a mansion. It's very sort of a Great Expectations, sort of Miss Havisham. There's clutter everywhere, and we were playing hide and seek, and I was the seeker, and I was starting to count, and I had my back turned. I was in the corner. I was counting. I could hear movement behind me, and for some reason, I just knew that it was this woman from my adolescence. And I turned around, and she was there, and she had this bottle of strange alcohol that had no label. It was just this brown alcohol. And she said, "Oh, I'm going to give some to everybody. I just wanted you to have some first." And she gave me this shot glass, and I didn't know what to do because I was in the corner and everybody had gone because they were hiding. So I just drank down this shot, and I had no idea what it was supposed to be. But I woke up then immediately as soon as I'd swallowed this strange alcohol. I woke up, and it stays with me. Those kinds of dreams and those kinds of experiences, they do stay with me for the rest of the day. Then I do find it affects my mood quite considerably.
So at the risk of being a bit of a psychoanalyst and putting you on the couch, it does seem to me, I know you've only used two examples, but as far as journalists are concerned, if you have two examples, you have a trend or you have a finding. A lot of your dreams in the book do seem to involve women. It's women who are slightly sinister characters. Would you agree with that analysis?
Yes, absolutely. There is a definite trend throughout the book. Obviously, I've chosen the dreams that I feel are worthy of including in the book. I mean, I had a dream once where I was running away from somebody and I disguised myself as a slice of pizza, an actual slice of pizza, which that doesn't really fit with the tone of the book. So I do tend to choose my scarier examples, but those examples do seem to involve sinister women, mostly, yes.
Have you ever tried to analyze that? Because you talk a little bit in the book about dream analysis.
Yeah.
You discuss in a very, very coherent way, better than I've seen it discussed elsewhere, Sigmund Freud and his interest in dreams and why dreams were important to him. We've gone through a phase in psychiatry where dreams were extremely important, and patients would go to a psychiatrist or a psychoanalyst in the 1920s and 30s, and if it was a particular kind of private practice, expect to discuss their dreams. Now, if patients try to discuss their dreams in a class, particularly NHS practice, they find them ignored. So I have a feeling that one of the projects of your book is to place dreams back a little bit as being more important because they've been a bit sidelined a bit since the beginning of the last century. What are your thoughts about that? And what are your thoughts about dream analysis, analyzing dreams?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of, obviously my students all know what I'm interested in and what I write, and they really love to tell me about their dreams. But I find them fascinating. I think they show such a sort of secret, hidden part of ourselves. Maybe not so much in the way that Freud thought, but when they're telling me their dreams, that's still sharing something very subjective and very meaningful to them. And I think some people I know I've heard people say that there's nothing more boring than listening to somebody tell you their dream, which I feel like I'm trying to campaign against. I think we should talk about our dreams more because it's you're sharing a really intimate part of yourself. But in terms of Freud, so obviously he thought that part of the things that we dreamt about was this idea of wishful thinking or kind of, wish fulfillment, that, the things you dreamt about were some sort of hidden desire that you had. And thinking about my own dreams, I really don't subscribe to that. There is another theory called threat rehearsal theory, whereby the dreams are thought of as being a kind of evolutionary thing, in that we dream about events that cause us anxiety or that might represent a threat, and we rehearse in the dream how we would deal with that threat. And so that if we do face that threat, again, in real life, we might be better equipped to deal with it because we've kind of almost already encountered it. In terms of, maybe in prehistory, if we were being faced by a lion, maybe we dreamt we were being attacked by some sort of predator, we could look around us in the dream and maybe pick up a rock and try that out as a defense mechanism. Nowadays it seems to be that you have dreams about sitting your GCSE geography exam again, which probably wouldn't happen, but I think that theory is more interesting to me than some of Freud's work. I think that idea of rehearsing these situations that give you anxiety, so that if you do ever face that again, you are better equipped to deal with that. And I think for me, in terms of the things that I dream about, which is resurgence of this woman from my adolescence. It's that, for me, it feels like, you know, I've almost rehearsed encountering her again, and what I might do, and, you know, if I do something bad in my dream, if I don't react the way that I would want to, I can then think about that in the day and think, oh, well, you know, if she had handed me that alcohol, I could have said no and batted it out of her hand or something like that. So that's the theory that I think is particularly interesting at the moment. And I think it does represent, you know, the idea that dreams allow us to think through some of our anxieties in a sort of a safe space, I suppose.
So that's a very interesting theory, and you're right. There's a big contrast between the psychoanalytic, slightly old-fashioned idea of unconscious drives. Let's just pick an arbitrary example. You fancy your boss. Let's just go with that. But you're repressing the fact you fancy your boss. And it comes out in the dream, right? There's a fancying boss type dream, okay? The Freudian would interpret that, obviously, as indicating something. So the dreams were famously described by Freud as a royal road to the unconscious, and he elevated the unconscious to being extremely important. So there's that theory. There's the more recent evolutionary psychology theory, which always tries to think about the evolutionary purpose of anything and about the idea that it contributes to survival value. But the reality is, either of these two theories, we don't really know why we dream. Isn't that right? And it's fascinating.
Yeah,
we still don't really know why we dream. Yeah, so, I mean, those are the two theories, but it's a mystery, isn't it? One of the really interesting things about your book is you embrace the mystery of sleep. It's mysterious even exactly why we sleep. That's still a bit of a mystery, for example. Tell us a bit about the fact you're drawn, I think, to mysteries. You're comfortable, in a sense, leaving it as a mystery, although you do explore lots of theories, but a lot of people are not. They want closure, don't they? It's actually described by psychology as a need for cognitive closure. Could you say a bit about that, about the fact that the mystery actually attracts you rather than repels you?
Yeah, well, I suppose it kind of goes back to my own experiences. And obviously, while I was writing the book, I was still having these experiences. I still do, you know, to this day. It's not really helped. Some people ask me, has it helped? And no, not really. But, you know, I was doing all this research, and I was learning for the first time what I was experiencing in a, you know, scientific, you know, neuroscientific way. You know, what was happening in my brain when I was hallucinating, what was happening when I was having sleep paralysis. And I thought, foolishly, that by knowing all these things and knowing the science of it, that would somehow make it less scary. And that, you know, if I had sleep paralysis, the next time, you know, I experienced it, I would say, oh, no, that is just the natural occurrence of my brain paralyzing my body so that I don't thrash around in my dream. Instead, what I'm actually thinking is, oh my God, there's a witch on top of me. And so I think no matter how much light you shine in terms of, you know, the scientific explanations for these sleep disorders, I think there will always be an aspect to it which is still emotional and still terrifying and still the stuff of, you know, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and still the stuff of fiction and superstition as well. And that's what I find really interesting, is that, you know, I've been charting the representation of sleep disorders throughout history and looking at, you know, the Salem witch trials and looking at the fictional and artistic representations of them. But even now, we know so much more about the brain, even though we still don't know why we dream and all those kinds of things. We know so much more than we did, yet there are still superstitions, there is still fear, there are still people going to hotels and leaving a bad TripAdvisor review because they thought there was a ghost in there when actually they had sleep paralysis. And that's, you know, in the last few years. So for me, I'm drawn to the mystery because it fascinates me that we can know so much factual information about sleep, and yet these particular sleep disorders, it's just that you can't resist sort of thinking about the superstitious aspect of it, or the supernatural elements of them, and believing in ghosts sometimes, even though you're so sure of all the things that are going on in your brain. You think, oh, it could have been a ghost though.
So let's talk a bit about nightmares, because they're a large part of what the book is about, and a large part of why sleep can be scary. And you talked about nightmares as maybe having a purpose to do with rehearsal, that there's an evolutionary theory that we have a nightmare, but it's trying to help us cope with monsters and lions and tigers and predators. It's an attempt. You talk about psychiatric disorders which are associated with nightmares, and that's a very important point, because actually in diagnosis, GPs in particular, maybe psychiatrists, don't ask enough about what goes on in people's sleep, because it can be a very, very subtle indicator of mental health problems, right? Like not being able to sleep or disturbed sleep is a very early indicator of mental health problems. Now, you talk very eloquently in the book about war neurosis or shell shock. Tell us a bit about that story, and about the fact that people with post-traumatic stress disorder frequently have nightmares. And then after that, we'll talk a bit about the treatment, because the treatment's really interesting. But tell us a bit about this notion of nightmare linked to psychiatric disorder.
Yeah, so one of the really interesting things I found when I was researching, obviously I was kind of thinking in terms of, you know, my own experience of having these things happen to me when I was 15 and then having nightmares subsequently. So it seemed like, you know, a kind of natural thing to research soldiers and post-traumatic stress in terms of World War I and those kinds of things. So I started to do some research, and I found this really interesting book about war neuroses written by a doctor in World War I, and looking at some of these soldiers, these very young soldiers who were in the trenches of World War I and were having these night terrors. And night terrors are quite a strange particular parasomnia, in that it involves, it's kind of like sleepwalking, where it's an involuntary movement where the sleeper knows that something odd is happening, and they're sort of driven by this sort of delusion. But with night terrors, it's very specifically driven by fear, really quite intense fear. It often includes screaming, and you can't really calm them down, and you just sort of have to let them come out of it on their own. It's actually usually associated with children. But I think this war neuroses book is quite influential in that it was showing these young men who had, in some cases, no prior sleep disturbances at all, going into war, and suddenly their sleep was completely ruined, and they were having these night terrors where they were screaming that they were still on the front lines, or that, you know, the bombs were coming down on them and they were just in the hospital bed, and they were screaming. And it's interesting because this doctor, he is treating them as though this is a really important symptom, that this is a really important thing that is happening as a consequence of these soldiers' trauma. But at the same time, there is this aspect where he kind of says, "Oh, they'll get over it, and then they can go back into the war." So it wasn't taken particularly seriously, but it was taken more seriously than I think it had ever been done before. But I think that was a pivotal moment in showing how trauma could very specifically affect a person's sleep because of trauma. And I think now this has provoked or encouraged research into post-traumatic stress and the nightmares that it includes, not just in terms of war, but in terms of, you know, people who've maybe survived a car accident or had an abusive relationship and have these recurring nightmares. Research is being done into, you know, how that can be alleviated, and then how that as a whole can help with their general mental state.
So one of the most prescribed drugs in Britain and around the world are drugs that help people sleep. And often people are really have got a secondary problem. They're overly anxious, or they have post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a kind of anxiety disorder, and they're not sleeping very well, or they have nightmares. Okay, and often they're sedated in order to help them sleep or deal with the nightmares. Now, you describe a very interesting psychological treatment for nightmares I want to talk about, because I'm a big fan of treatments that don't involve drugs. And it's actually a treatment people ought to be more aware of, because nightmares are so common. And then I want to discuss with you, because it's controversial, as to why that treatment works. Okay, and you very eloquently, again in the book, describe the clinical trial data about it and why it might work. But tell us what that treatment is. I think it's got the abbreviation IRT, I think.
Yes, yeah. So IRT, image rehearsal therapy. It's fairly new. I think it's had its roots in ideas of treating nightmares and things like that for a long time. But I think in terms of a clinical sense, it's only kind of been the last few years, last decade, that this has been really at the forefront of treating nightmares. And so what it involves is trying to, I suppose, trigger another parasomnia, which is called lucid dreaming, the stuff of Christopher Nolan's Inception. It's where you're dreaming and something triggers you into thinking, oh, hang on, this is a dream. And then you can assert control to some extent over the course of this dream. And it can be learned as well. It can be a learned skill, which I think is really fascinating, that you can learn essentially to cultivate this lucid dreaming. And so what this IRT, this image rehearsal therapy, does is, if a person is having nightmares, and particularly recurring nightmares, I think it works best when the nightmares are of a similar theme or a similar narrative progression, is to take that nightmare, to write it down. And I think this is why it interests me, because it's sort of creative writing, to write it down and then to take some of the scary aspects or the worst parts of the dream and essentially rewrite them. So say you're having maybe you've survived a car crash and you have recurring dreams of the car about to hit a tree, for example. In image rehearsal therapy, you would write that down. And so I'm driving in the car and the tree comes up to me. And then you could say something like, and then the tree sprouts legs and runs off. And I keep driving and I go to, somewhere nice. So you're actually taking the dream and changing it. And if you do that enough times, and if you practice that and read it back to yourself over and over again, and while you're also trying to learn to lucid dream, when you next have this dream that you're in the car and you're about to hit the tree, you go, oh, hang on, this isn't how the dream works. The tree's going to sprout legs and walk off. And then it does. And some of the clinical trials of this have been incredibly successful, and really shown that even if the participant doesn't manage to lucid dream, because lucid dreams are quite tricky. It's kind of like trying to hold water in your hands. It's quite a slippery thing. Even if the participant doesn't manage to achieve that sort of lucid dreaming state, they did find that even just the practice of rewriting a dream on paper would actually help with the anxiety and with the dream content itself. So I find that absolutely fascinating, that just using creative writing essentially can help with these nightmares.
So the theory about nightmares and anxiety here is that the fact you've had these recurrent nightmares all week makes you anxious about going to sleep, right? Because you have heightened anxiety, the theory is, as you go to sleep, because you have heightened anxiety, that makes it even more likely you're going to have the nightmare, because a nightmare arises out of anxiety. Okay, so you get trapped in this spiral. So one theory about this IRT treatment is that in getting people to actively rehearse the dream, it's a bit like what's called graded exposure. If you're frightened of spiders, the treatment is you must confront spiders. Never a popular treatment, but it's one of the only treatments that work. So you have to confront spiders in a graded manner. You're not given a big tarantula. I was actually was frighteningly called the Mexican bird-eating spider in London Zoo on my lap once as part of the. I was making a program about the treatment of spider phobias. I didn't have a spider phobia. That was up until I met the Mexican bird-eating spider, which is a very big spider indeed. Anyway, my point is that you start off with small spiders and then you work your way up to big spiders. And the theory is, if you stay in a room with small spiders to begin with for long enough, then your anxiety comes down inevitably, because for various reasons. And that's a kind of graded exposure treatment for anything you're frightened of. You're frightened of heights, frightened of flying, expose yourself to it. So in the scary dream scenario of the car crash with the tree, in rehearsing it when you're awake, you're doing a kind of exposure, and it's meant to calm you down. Now, the other thing is, what makes the dream scary is what's happening at the end, right? There's the thing about dreams, and which is why they're very interesting for narration principles. How do you grip an audience and then carry them through a story, right? You hint heavily. There's a sense in which the audience is 3 steps ahead of the narration. They're thinking, oh, this is going to end in a car crash, and Hitchcock was very good at this, right? He drew you in, so you thought you knew what was going to happen next, and it was scary as a result. But you had to wait patiently while the tension build. So this is going to end in a car crash, which is why it's scary to be in the car in the first place. If the tree gets up and walks away, then you've taken away the kind of denouement, the end point, and therefore maybe the car journey becomes less scary for all those psychological reasons, and maybe that works. But you see, I have a version of this. This was a sneaky way of getting you to talk about this, so I can bring my version to the party, which is that I think that the better version, and there's no way of knowing which is correct, is that in the car crash example, I get people to rehearse the dream, just like you've said. Now, you see, you being a creative person, you went with the tree as sprouts legs and walked off, right? That's a creative thing. I do a more boring thing in that I say, you are so skilled at driving that as you lose control of the car, you regain control of the car and you drive past the tree. And then I asked them to go on advanced driving courses. Once you pass the first driving course, you can do advanced driving, right? So you see what's going on now. I'm actually getting them to develop a better sense of mastery of the car. Okay, so my version of it isn't, you can go your version, which is like the Harry Potter version, which is we deploy the fantasy element of dreams, right? And you know, you got to do whatever suits your character. I feel the fantasy element would suit your character, but for a lot of the people that I see, the idea that you actually develop more skilled driving and wrest control of the car back from the car crashing into the tree is more appealing because they can believe in that more. But the fact we go and make them do advanced driving, and in advanced driving they simulate, you know, the potential for crashes and stuff, is a kind of exposure, right? So two things are happening. They're doing exposure and they're developing mastery. And I think that is kind of important in dealing with anxiety and what leads to nightmares. Anyway, the key point, whether we disagree or agree over what IRT can be about, and you're open to use of imagination, there is a non-pharmacological treatment for nightmares. That's the key point, right? And I think that people should be aware of that, because unfortunately GPs only have 6 minutes and they tend to write a prescription fast. So what are your thoughts about what we're saying, that people should be more aware of this treatment? Because nightmares are a very common problem.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think people don't realize that lucid dreaming is a real thing. I think at the moment its representation in fiction is very much in the realm of science fiction, that it's, you know, some sort of weird hooking your brain up to wires and downloading something, you know, it's that kind of thing. But actually this has been something that's been discussed about for, you know, about 200 years. There was a really good source that I found, I think it was late 19th century, of this woman who said that she'd had nightmares for a very long time. And she had learned on her own, without, even though lucid dreaming hadn't really been given a term at that point, she'd learned how to recognize that she was dreaming. And then if she was having a nightmare, she wouldn't even do anything remotely creative. She would just go, I don't like this, I'm going to wake up now. And she would just wake up. She knew she was dreaming. And as soon as she did, she would just wake herself up and then go back to sleep and hope she didn't dream about it again. And that's, you know, the end of the 19th century. But in the 1980s, there was a really influential researcher called Stephen LaBerge, who was working, you know, in terms of trying to prove that lucid dreaming was a thing, because at that point it was just sort of hearsay, like, oh yeah, of course you can tell you're dreaming. That's funny. But he actually managed to, you know, try and prove it using rapid eye movement. And having the sleeper send signals through rapid eye movement in their dream. And some of the stuff that he talks about is in terms of using lucid dreaming and learning to lucid dream in order to, you know, turn dreams into what you want them to be. You know, they don't have to be scary. They can be fun and they can be creative, or you just don't have to dream at all. If you don't like the way it's going, you can just stop it. But yeah, lucid dreaming, you know, if you think about it enough and if you practice enough in terms of going, am I dreaming? No, I'm not sure. No. You know, asking yourself those questions and being conscious about what is a dream and what is real life, you do find that it does become much more prominent. And I find writing dreams down in a dream diary really triggers lucid dreaming for me as well. So that's something that might help. You know, if you are having nightmares, try writing them down every day and try, you know, doing a bit of reading into lucid dreaming, and you might find that suddenly you can do it every night, and then you can just stop the dreams from happening at all, or change them into something nice if you want to.
So let's run over, because you said a lot of things there, and I want to just run over some of it because it's very important material. So lucid dreaming, that's the term, are dreams where you are in a dream, but you know you're dreaming, first point, right? Which is a bit weird, because always you wake up after a dream and go, oh, that was a dream. Because the point about dreams is you don't know it's a dream until after you've woken up. But the next bit is that you control the dream, and you can start flying. That's a classic lucid dream thing, right? And you can dictate what happens. You can be like the director of your own movie. Okay. And I'm sorry, I've got to do this as a psychiatrist. I have to say that everyone listening to this is already, I imagine, thinking of certain kinds of dreams they would generate to do with Angelina Jolie and George Clooney, let's say. But which you steer clear of, interestingly, in the book. But the gripping idea then for many people is, wow, I can have dreams where I'm in a virtual reality situation where I believe it's real, but I'm in control. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's something very attractive to a lot of people about the idea of lucid dreaming. It's actually even more attractive than being awake, almost, isn't it? It's something enticing about it. But
Yeah.
before we move on, could you just say something about that bit? Because I think
Yeah. Well,
it gripped the imagination for a while in the 80s and seems to have died a bit in terms of the grip. But it seemed like an answer to the stress of life, in a way, basically. Anyway, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, in 2010, so Christopher Nolan released Inception, which is a dream about knowing that you're dreaming, but it was in a sort of science fiction realm. But that, I think, really caused a resurgence in interest in lucid dreaming. So we had this sort of burst in the 1980s, and then it fell away, and then suddenly Inception comes out, and there is a subgroup on Reddit, the forum website, that's dedicated to lucid dreaming. And I think the last time I checked was September 2021, and it had 400,000 members. And it's this whole community of people wishing each other luck or celebrating successes, sharing tips, sharing advice, sharing stories that they've had of, yes, I finally did it. And it's all kind of like a rite of passage when a member of this subreddit suddenly says, oh, I've had a lucid dreaming. Everybody congratulates them. And it has become a real community, and people are like, oh, I'm so frustrated. I've been trying for 6 months and I've not had anything. And everyone says, oh, keep going. Oh, have you tried this? And that subreddit for me really suggests that, there is this resurgence. And I think to some extent it's formed in relation to the way that video games are becoming much more immersive, and we're having virtual reality goggles and things like that, because that inspires real sort of sandbox playing of the freedom of being able to do what you want and experience these realities through virtual reality goggles. But you only have kind of so much leeway with that. You're still playing this game about a fantasy landscape or whatever it is. There's no immense freedom, which is what supposedly you get in a lucid dream. And so I think people have this taste of experiencing this other reality through virtual reality, but they want more. They want something even more realistic than that, and something that they can control completely. Although I do find that lucid dreams, I think they're promoted as something that you have endless control over, but I've found that they're odd, and you have to sort of obey certain rules of physics. So for example, if I have a lucid dream, and maybe it's just me, maybe it's just my brain, but if I have a lucid dream and I want somebody to appear, so I'm a big fan of 1940s cinema. I love Betty Davis films and all that kind of stuff. So Humphrey Bogart and those kinds of things. So say I wanted to make Humphrey Bogart appear in front of me. He doesn't, because that in real life that wouldn't happen. Somebody doesn't just appear in front of you. So I have to use a kind of weird roundabout way of doing it, in that I sort of try and bring him in naturally. And usually what I'll do is I'll have my hand behind my back, and I'll say very loudly to myself, Humphrey Bogart's here, and he's going to take my hand. And then I feel a hand take mine. 8 times out of 10, I'll turn around and it's the person I want it to be. Sometimes I'll feel this hand grasp mine and I'll turn around and nobody's there. So lucid dreamings can still be quite creepy, I find. And you do have to play by certain rules in terms of what your brain knows will naturally happen and sort of won't naturally happen. So yeah, it is quite tricky. But I think in terms of being able to stop a nightmare, I've had certain situations where I've had a really horrible nightmare about zombies or something horrible. I realize I'm dreaming, and then I can just stop it. Usually if I'm having a nightmare, I don't really do anything fun with it. I just kind of say, I don't want this, I'm just going to end it. But if I'm having a fairly boring dream and for some reason I realize that I'm lucid, I might try and play around with it a little bit. But I think that it has become far more popular now. I think because of communities, I think because of social media and people sharing experiences and sort of working together as well to do it. So there's a real community for something so subjective and so personal. Lucid dreaming has a community like nothing I've ever seen in terms of sleep.
So let's run over a little bit, because people may be skeptical about what we're talking about. Let's go back over the history of how it emerged. So there's a thing called rapid eye movement sleep, or REM. So there are different phases of sleep. Just because you're asleep doesn't mean you're dreaming. Dreaming actually occurs only in a very small part of sleep, really. Okay. And the way that sleep researchers know you're dreaming is your eyes start to move rapidly, which kind of mimics the fact you may be looking around a scene in a dream and you're having some kind of visual experience, although you're asleep, right? So you can pick this up with the recording devices, EEGs and other devices in a sleep laboratory that rapid eye movement sleep has begun, and that means the person's dreaming. Okay, so they trained people who could lucid dream to move their eyes in a certain way, which was therefore able to send a signal, as it were, from sleep or dream to the researcher who's awake in the lab, that the person is sending a signal that they're dreaming. So that was the first bit of evidence, correct me if I'm wrong, that actually, in a scientific sense, that this was a real phenomenon. Then this researcher that you mentioned developed a device, again, you must correct me if I'm wrong, whereby the device you wore, it could pick up when rapid eye movement sleep had begun, then would flash lights at you. Your eyelids were closed, but you would still see the light through the eyelid. And that was a signal to you that you were in a dream, and you would start lucid dreaming. You were trained in a way to spot the lights, and that would signal to you that a dream was beginning. So that was a device that was meant to encourage lucid dreaming. Have I got that right?
Yes, yeah. It was called the Dream Light device, I think.
Okay. And then there are other techniques which are much simpler to encourage lucid dreaming. And one of them is to ask yourself when you're awake, is this a dream? You do reality testing, the way you put it in the book, right? By the way, I do that anyway with some of my nightmare patients. I say to them in the middle of the day, this must be a dream, a nightmare. And there's a moment in the John Cleese series, Fawlty Towers, where he says he thinks it can't be happening. This must be a nightmare that he's in. So he bangs his head against the table and says, oh no, I'm awake. Just stuck with it, I think he says. So I think this is quite an interesting idea. The idea being that if you keep asking yourself, is this a dream? Is this real or is this a dream? You will start doing that in a dream. And that will then liberate you to realize you're in a dream, right? Could you say a bit about that? Because I think you do that one a bit. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I find that I'm in a situation that's really weird. And I just have to go, hang on, am I dreaming this? I don't know. But I do, so these reality checks, I do, ask myself fairly often, during the day, how do I know? How can I be absolutely sure that I'm not dreaming? The one I do is that I pinch my nose, and if I can't, and I close my mouth, and if I can't breathe, then it's obviously real. But in a lucid dream, for some reason, I can pinch my nose and I can still breathe through my nose, and it's a very odd feeling. But that's the one that I use. And so if you ever see me go, it's because something weird's happening to me, and I'm not quite sure if I'm dreaming or not. But there are different techniques that I think people have cultivated. So there's the reality check. There's one where, and I don't try this because I love sleep. And once I'm asleep, unless I'm having some sort of terrible nightmare, I don't wake up for anything. Where you wake up at sort of 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, do something for half an hour and then go back to sleep. And the theory is that you then have a really intense period of REM sleep where you're more likely to just spontaneously have a lucid dream. And there's another one where when you're lying in bed, you press your hand on the mattress and you very lightly move your first and second finger up and down as though you're playing a piano key without actually pressing the key down. And after a while, you've actually fallen asleep, but you're dreaming that you're still repeating those movements, and then suddenly you're in a lucid dream. So I think that's fascinating as well. Again, this community aspect that people are almost doing science in their own bedrooms because they're trying to experiment and trying to find ways of being able to lucid dream and to lucid dream on command, every night.
But there's a problem, isn't there? Which is that this kind of like community congratulation that you finally had a lucid dream. Unless you're in a sleep laboratory where it's been verified scientifically because you're wired up and they can measure it, there's a very strong peer pressure thing for people to make claims about dreams, which may not be true. So now you describe also a philosopher who you said must have been great fun at parties, who tried to make the point that we need to be very careful that we can never really be absolutely certain that a lucid dream has occurred, because all you've got is someone's report after they've woken up of what happened when they were asleep, right? And he is making, I think, quite a rigorous and important point. What do you think about that allegation?
Yes. I mean, lucid dreamings are like, they're unlike anything I've ever felt. And they are so hard to describe. If you've never had one, it's so hard to describe. And it's so hard to hear a description of them and to go, oh yeah, that definitely happened, because it's like lifting the curtain and seeing all the backstage workings, and it's kind of, there's a part of you that thinks this shouldn't be happening. I shouldn't be allowed to see this part of my brain. It's quite odd. But so yes, this philosopher, that was in the 1950s, I think, where he said, is there absolutely any way that we can be sure that if a person thinks they were awake in a dream, that they weren't just dreaming, that they were awake in a dream? And I think at that point, you couldn't really argue against him. But there has been some more recent research done in terms of brain waves. And something that was discovered, which I find absolutely fascinating, is that we have sort of two different patterns. So we have a brainwave pattern when we're awake, with our waking consciousness brain pattern, and then our sleep sleep brainwave pattern. And when people have lucid dreamt, they found, these researchers found that the sleeping brainwaves suddenly had aspects of waking consciousness, suddenly had these spikes of what they would expect in waking consciousness patterns. But even so, there could be some other explanation for that. But to me, that does seem to suggest that there is something more going on with a lucid dream than just the usual brainwave patterns that we experience in sleep. I mean, a dream is very present tense. Sorry to use another creative writing term, but dreams are very in the present. You're taken in by whatever situation you're dumped into, and you just go along with it, no matter what happened in the past or what's happening in the future. It's just, you're rooted in the present in a dream. Whereas a lucid dream, suddenly you have your past, and you can remember your past. You can think about the future. You can think, hang on, I've dreamt about this before, and this is what happened last time, or this is related to that film I watched last night, and you're actually thinking about that in the dream. So there is this sense that your consciousness is much more open in a lucid dream, and I think that's reflected in these brainwave patterns, that there are aspects of waking consciousness overlaying the dreaming brainwaves.
But we need to be quite careful here, because I think that some people listening to this may think a lucid dream is like being fully awake. There's a sense in which when you're in a lucid dream, you're not fully awake, because you haven't got complete control. You have an element of control, as you quite nicely described with the Humphrey Bogart example that you gave. Yeah. That's correct, isn't it? It's not like being completely asleep and completely in a dream. We have no control. And it's not like being completely awake, where you have full volitional control over what goes on in your body.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like being pretty much almost awake. I suppose it's kind of, when you first wake up in the morning and you're still quite groggy, you're like, oh, what year is it? I don't know. It's that kind of consciousness where you are awake, but it's not quite full wakefulness. I mean, I find in a lucid dream that my personality is quite different, even though I am, awake and I'm aware that this is a dream. I find I'm quite obnoxious. I'm quite loud and very extroverted, which is not who I am at all. So there is still, even in a lucid dream, when I know I'm dreaming and I'm, feel like I'm awake, there's still aspects of my personality that are a bit different. But also, lucid dreaming can almost be like a battle with your own mind to stay awake. There's always this sense that the dream is trying to get back to what it was supposed to be, and you have to keep reminding yourself that this is a dream, because if anything distracts you at all, you just slip back into that normal state of dreaming where you're just going along with whatever. So people, while they're lucid dreaming, they will have a reality check that they will do in a lucid dream. I think one of them is to try and push your fingers through your hand, which is quite grotesque. But they will try and remind themselves every 10 seconds that this is a dream, because the moment you stop, you just fall back into that normal state of dreaming.
So now this is the little bit where the gloves come off a bit, and I did warn you that I might be a bit challenging and provocative. So I thought the stuff on lucid dreaming is really interesting, and I think lucid dreaming as part of this IRT therapy you mentioned, which helps people deal with nightmares, is very valuable clinically. So I want to say that up front, right? But let me take a personal example, and you're gonna want to analyze me after I tell you this. Let's take one example. I love playing tennis, okay, and I'm very competitive, as everyone at my tennis club will tell you. Now, I have no interest whatsoever in having a lucid dream where I win 6-love against Roger Federer. Okay. Yeah. It does not interest me at all. I'm interested in going and playing a real live game of tennis and trying to win. Okay. So there's a sense in which I think there's a kind of person who's drawn to lucid dreaming who, in a way, finds real life at some level unsatisfying or disheartening, and that it's a retreat. Now, we all enjoy a glass of wine, or in my case, a stiff martini after a nightmare day at work on a Friday evening. And there's a sense in which we all through human history have needed a retreat from the harsh reality of life. I'm not against that. I think that's therapeutic. Okay. So there's a sense in which what we're talking about fills that role. But there's also a sense that there's a group of people, when they go to a movie or read a book, get really absorbed by the movie, get really absorbed by the book. And, creative types might be like that. They really are lost in the thing, okay? And it's almost like they're in the thing, right? And you can tell those people because when the credits start to roll at the end of a movie in a cinema, they take a long while to come out of the reverie. They're the ones who take a long while to get out of the chair, whereas people like me are...
You've got things to do.
Yeah, hello. I don't want to get stuck in the car park behind. So I'm off and running, whereas everyone else is a bit more in. So while I was watching the film, I was always fully aware this is a film. Okay? I was never lost in it. And similarly, when I'm reading a book, to the extent that I'm very annoying to go to cinema with, because I will often shout out, "That just can't happen," and my wife will go, "Shh, it's just a film." It's just a film. Anyway, so what are your thoughts about this idea that for a certain group of people that get lost in something, it's a retreat from the world? Retreating from the world can be psychologically beneficial, but it can also, if you do it too much, be a sign that you're not engaging with the world. And the other thing is, I think there's something interesting when you do creative writing or let's say a director making a film, you could do it in an imaginative, creative, intelligent way. You can have lucid dreams that are rather, how should I put this? Uncreative, unimaginative, and just fill basic human needs. Or you can be the architecture of something more interesting, right? So there's something about that going on in lucid dreams, which I think is revealing about people. And I actually think you're drawn to it because you like using your imagination. And I think it's a good thing mental health wise for people to be encouraged to use their imagination. But I think the education system, whatever, we're disencouraged a lot of the time from being imaginative. Anyway, I've said a lot of stuff there. A lot of it was a bit rambly. What are your thoughts? What's your reaction?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That it does seem to be that because lucid dreaming has become so popular in the last few years, there seem to be different pockets of reactions to them. There's the people who are working on them in a clinical basis. There are people like me who write a book about them, or just kind of, if it happens, it happens. I don't really put a lot of effort into lucid dreaming. Usually it just happens spontaneously. But sometimes if something weird is happening, I will kind of go, well, how do I know this isn't a dream? But as I was talking about this subreddit, I mean, that is a real case of seeing people for whom lucid dreaming is almost like a spiritual sort of, it takes up their entire lives, and the effort they put into just achieving one of them is spectacular. They've never even had one before, and yet somehow they're so taken in by this idea of limitless freedom. If I'd never had one before, I probably wouldn't be particularly interested in trying to do it, unless I was having really bad nightmares and it was advised that I should have a go. But it was only because I really started them when I was about 16. I just started to have them naturally. But for these people, they've never had one before. But it's only by anecdotes and by other people saying, oh, it was great. And, I had this dream where Angelina Jolie was there and, we had a great time. And people are obsessed with trying to have one of these lucid dreams, which I think is absolutely fascinating, that they can be so drawn to something that they've never experienced before, that's so subjective, and they're just taking it by anecdotal evidence from other people. And you do occasionally, because I do look at that sometimes, and there are questions where people say, I've been having lucid dreams a lot recently, and I'm really enjoying them, and actually my real life pales in comparison, and can you get addicted to them? Research has been done to suggest that, that there's no evidence that lucid dreaming is in any way harmful. But it is fascinating that there are these people for whom it is an obsession. It's not just something that happens spontaneously or something that is useful in a sort of nightmare, therapeutic sense, but it's just because, as you say, maybe they find their own life boring or unsatisfactory in some way. And so they want to have this, limitless freedom to live out their fantasies in a very vivid, almost visceral sense. But there's also, as well as that, does seem to be a cult of people thinking that lucid dream will help you be more productive in some way, because we waste time when we're asleep, and we should have access to these 8 hours. How dare they be taken away from us in sleep? And so you do get some articles where it's like, if you learn to lucid dream, you can work on that big work presentation that you've got next week. I was like, I've been
no. I love that. It was a fascinating part of the book. I thought you were making a very interesting comment on our culture, which is like you could be revising for exams while you're asleep. For God's sake. I mean, sleep is a refuge from stuff like that. You could be writing reports. You could be more productive. So I love the idea that you did trade on this notion that we live in a culture that's obsessed with productivity and obsessed with superior performance. So, I mean, thank God created sleep to give us a break from that relentless running away. Now, there's another thing I want to discuss, though, which is that you are very comfortable, because I think you're an imaginative person, you do creative writing, and you're a creative person. You're kind of comfortable with wherever your mind might take you, okay? And in a way, you want your mind to come up with strange ideas. There's a sense in which strangeness, I know this sounds like paradoxical, but you're comfortable with strangeness as generated by your mind. You can be scared by it by a bit. So the best example I can come up with, the point I'm trying to make, is Stephen King comes up with very bizarre, slightly horrifying stories that are very disturbing. Yet when you meet, we see the guy being interviewed, he's very
lovely,
he's a very ordinary chap. He's not a serial killer sharpening his knives. But clearly what's happened is he's just very comfortable sitting around thinking up really bizarre and strange ideas. He doesn't go around going, what kind of weird person must I be that I just came up with that thought? Now, there is a lot of people who are kind of scared of their own minds, right? They're kind of scared that a thought will come into their mind, usually a perverted thought or something not socially acceptable. And then they get disturbed by the fact they had that thought. They go, what kind of person must I be? Creative, imaginative people like you, I think, have really relaxed about whatever bizarre thought. You're not thinking, I must be a really weird person because I had that weird thought. And there's something, in my opinion, about mental health that is about a bit. Like you're being comfortable with your mind, whereas a lot of people are in trouble because they are not comfortable in their own minds, and they're actually a bit hypervigilant and worried about what their mind might come up with next. Do you have any thoughts about what I'm trying to say there? Again, I didn't put it very well.
No, I think that's a really interesting comment, and I'm trying to wonder why, because I do have weird, all my sleep experiences are quite weird and not really related to who I am in the daytime, which is Paddington Bear, basically. And I think for me, it's to do with reading, I think, and I think it's to do with books, and to read books by people who are really lovely and affable and jolly, and to read these really terrifying books. I think Stephen King is the prime example of that. And I think just by reading these things, and also by looking at these anecdotes, that census of hallucinations that the Society for Psychical Research did in 1894, that's just ordinary people. It's like a woman who's 27 or something, and she's telling her story about the skeleton that popped out of her bedroom door, and that kind of thing. But it's just a normal person. And I think for that, doing this research, I think that is what has really helped me become comfortable, because prior to doing any research to this book, I just wouldn't tell anybody that I was having these things, because I thought, oh God, I'm hallucinating spiders and horrible figures in my bedroom all the time. What's going wrong with me? And then doing this research and realizing that it's actually not so strange after all, and that writers have them, that they use it as inspiration for their stories, or perfectly normal people have them and they just write their little anecdote down and send it off to a survey. That's really helped me, I think, because seeing other people be comfortable with their experiences has helped me be more comfortable. And I think that's really what I wanted to accomplish with Night Terrors, was to get everybody who reads it that has these experiences to also feel comfortable with where their mind goes at night, and to tell those stories and to talk about it more.
Yeah, so this leads us to a deeper point, which goes back to the Freudian revolution, which happened around 1900. The Interpretation of Dreams, the book by Sigmund Freud, was published in 1900. So the Freudian psychoanalytic view is that deep down within us are all of us are ordinary people, but we harbor homicidal impulses towards our boss. We harbor the most perverted and strange ideas. All that happens is we just keep it to ourselves, and we turn up and more tea, vicar, that kind of thing. We're kind of like we understand that the requirements of civilization is not that we say to our boss, I want to stab you in the eye with a pencil. You say, thank you very much for that extra work you've given me. And so the Freudian ideas deep within people are this seething mass of unconscious, unacceptable impulses. And the power of Freudian therapy was people were given permission to say anything. They were given permission to say, oh, I fancy, my best friend's wife, that kind of thing. And it was liberating that there was no judgment. Okay, it was kind of an acceptance of deep within the human soul is perversion, is neurosis, is aggression, violence, etc., etc. Okay, do you think we've lost that in a way that dreams reveal that? Because dreams are usually disturbing things; they're not acceptable. People don't have boring dreams, do they? Where you kind of fell asleep in a dream because it was so boring. There's a sense in which dreams are a way of connecting back to something that at a dinner party everyone is smiling and charming, but beware, beneath the surface people are weird and people have got a lot of other things going on, and we've kind of lost touch with that. The Freudians kind of tried to introduce us to that idea. And what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of my favorite quotes or quotations that I use in the book is by a Victorian art critic, John Ruskin, and he said that we have this darkness within us, and I quite like that because I don't think all darkness can be necessarily bad, and I don't think all weirdness can be necessarily bad either. I quite like to embrace anything weird that goes on in my life. But then I trust myself not to be a homicidal maniac. So I think there are limits in terms of how much of that darkness you can embrace. In terms of obviously if it's hurting other people, maybe don't embrace it. But if it's just a kind of a weird dream where you go and trash some houses or something, it's that kind of, I suppose it goes back to that sort of childhood destructive impulse, which I think, is something that we have in dreams quite a lot. I mean, particularly in a lucid dream, because there's no consequences. It's quite fun to just smash a plant pot and, go on with. I mean, that's a kind of a suggestion of how violent I think I can be, is to smash a plant pot. That's about as aggressive as I can go. Oh, smash a plant pot. Oh dear.
Yeah, but you do make the comment in dreams, lucid dreams in particular, often very destructive. It's quite interesting that people take an opportunity to knock over something straight away. The first thing they do when they realize they're actually in a lucid dream is do something destructive, which is quite interesting. So we're running out of time a little bit. Just to remind people, this is Night Terrors by Alice Vernon, Troubled Sleep and the Stories we tell about it. So the final, most difficult, provocative, challenging point I want to come to right at the end, because there's no escape, is that we live in a woke moment where people take offense very easily. So we're always treading really carefully in conversation that we don't say anything that might offend someone, right? So is there a danger, and obviously it's a slightly biased question, you know where I'm coming from on this one, is there a danger that we lose something, we lose a freedom to express ourselves, that occasionally in a conversation, if you are being free, you will offend someone, but it's not the end of the world, and that the woke thing is there's a grave danger of stifling imagination and stifling connection between people, because dreams are not woke, quite the contrary, they're very unwoke, as it were. Anyway, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I try and teach my students is to write from a unique experience that they have that doesn't harm, essentially, that does no harm. I think there was a writer, I can't remember her name, but Kit Duvall, I think, said, write in a way that does no harm. And I think that's really important. And I know that dreams, you can have a dream where you think, oh God, that was awful. The things I did or the things I said in that dream were terrible. And I think in that case, I think it's just about being a decent human being and not going around and being like, oh, hey, listen to this dream I had where I was a horrible racist person. I think it's just it's not about self-censorship or censorship in any way. I think it's just, not perpetuating harm by saying some of these things that are problematic. I think dreams are unfiltered, but that doesn't mean in our waking lives we have to be. And we don't need to take those opinions and take those ideas into our waking lives, essentially. So yeah, I feel like in that respect, it is about not doing harm in terms of the things that you're talking about and the things that you're telling other people about, essentially.
On that note, we've run out of time. Thank you very much, Alice Vernon, for talking to us. The book again is titled Night Terrors by Alice Vernon, Troubled Sleep and the Stories We Tell About It. Alice, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Raj.